The sound of rifle fire shattered the quiet dawn as Grace Norton fled barefoot through the tall grass, her heart pounding against her ribs like a wild animal desperate for escape. Behind her, the silhouettes of three men on horseback appeared against the horizon, their forms becoming clearer as the sun crept higher. She had been running for so long that sometimes it seemed like she had never known anything else. Colorado Territory, 1869. Grace ducked beneath a low-hanging branch and pressed her back against the rough bark of a cottonwood tree. Her breathing came in ragged gasps as she peered around the trunk. The men were still there, distant but determined. They had been tracking her for 3 days now, ever since she'd slipped away from their camp near Pikes Peak. This was how it had been for 5 long years, moments of fragile peace shattered by the need to run again. The wanted poster with her likeness had spread through every settlement from Missouri to the Rocky Mountains. Grace Norton wanted for murder and theft. The charges were false, but that hardly mattered anymore. Not when men with guns and the scent of reward money in their nostrils were constantly on her trail. Grace flexed her blistered feet and adjusted the small canvas pack containing everything she owned: a spare dress, a tarnished locket with her mother's portrait, a small hunting knife, and the diary that documented her innocence. The evidence that could clear her name was sealed inside its pages, yet no one would listen to a woman accused of killing a prominent businessman. As the riders appeared to change direction, Grace took the opportunity to move deeper into the woods that bordered the eastern edge of the foothills. She needed water, food, and most desperately, rest. 5 years of living wild had taught her to survive, but her body was reaching its limits. By midday, she had managed to put several miles between herself and her pursuers. A small creek provided much-needed water, and she even managed to catch 2 small fish with her improvised willow branch spear. As the sun began to set, Grace found a sheltered hollow between 2 large boulders. It would do for the night. With practiced efficiency, she built a small fire, just enough to cook her fish and provide a little warmth against the autumn chill. The dancing flames cast flickering shadows across her face, highlighting the delicate features that had once belonged to a society woman from St. Louis, now weathered by years of hardship. Grace stared into the fire, her mind traveling back to the night that had changed everything. The night she had discovered Benjamin Whitaker's scheme to defraud dozens of investors, including her late father. The night she had confronted him with evidence of his crimes, only to find him dead minutes later and a gun planted in her hand. She had been framed by Whitaker's partners, men with enough money and influence to ensure she would never find justice, so she had run. The sound of a twig snapping brought Grace instantly alert. She reached for her knife, muscles tensed for flight. 5 years had honed her instincts to razor sharpness. "I mean you no harm, madam." The voice came from the darkness beyond the circle of firelight. Deep and even, with a subtle drawl that placed its owner somewhere south of the Mason-Dixon line, Grace remained frozen, knife clutched in her white-knuckled grip. "Show yourself," she demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. A tall figure emerged slowly from the shadows, hands held slightly away from his sides to show he wasn't reaching for a weapon. The firelight revealed a man in his early 30s, broad-shouldered and lean-hipped in the way of those who spent most of their lives in the saddle. He wore a worn leather vest over a faded blue shirt, dusty canvas pants, and scuffed boots. A well-used Stetson was pushed back on his head, revealing a face that was all angles and planes, weathered by sun and wind. "Name's Quincy Grayson," he said, keeping his distance. "I noticed your fire." "Camping alone isn't safe in these parts." Grace tightened her grip on the knife. "I can take care of myself." The stranger Quincy nodded thoughtfully. "I don't doubt that. You look like you've had plenty of practice." His eyes, which she could now see were a startling shade of blue, took in her threadbare dress, tangled hair, and the wariness in her posture. "But everyone needs to rest sometime." He gestured toward the fire. "Mind if I sit? Night's getting cold." Grace hesitated, every instinct screaming danger. Men were not to be trusted, especially not handsome strangers who appeared out of nowhere in the wilderness. But there was something in his steady gaze that didn't trigger her usual alarm bells. "Your weapons stay where I can see them," she finally said. Quincy nodded again, slowly removing a revolver from his holster and placing it on a rock several feet from where he settled himself on the ground. "Been riding all day," he explained, stretching his long legs toward the fire. "Horse needed a break, and so did I." As he sat beside her fire, maintaining a respectful distance, he looked directly at her and said softly, "Rest with me, just for a while." The simple words carried no threat, no demand, just an offer that seemed to encompass more than just sitting by a fire for a few hours. Grace studied him warily. "What do you want, right now? Just some company and maybe a share of whatever's cooking. Smells mighty fine." His smile transformed his face, softening the hard edges and lighting up his eyes. Against her better judgment, Grace found herself relaxing slightly. "Fish," she said. "Not much to share, I'm afraid." "I've got some jerky and hardtack in my saddlebag," he offered. "Could make a proper meal between us." She nodded cautiously, and he whistled softly. A moment later, a magnificent chestnut gelding ambled into the firelight. Quincy retrieved a leather pouch from his saddlebag before sending the horse to graze nearby. As they ate together in silence, Grace couldn't help but wonder about this cowboy who had appeared out of nowhere. He didn't look like a bounty hunter, but she had learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving. "What brings you to these parts?" she finally asked. Quincy finished chewing a piece of fish before answering. "Heading to Denver, got a job waiting with a cattle outfit. You?" Grace tensed again. "Just passing through." He nodded as if this was a perfectly reasonable explanation for a woman alone in the wilderness. "Been passing through for a while," looks like. Her eyes narrowed. "What makes you say that? The way you move, the way you've got that knife ready." "The fact that your hands are calloused but your speech says you weren't born to it," he shrugged. A man notices things, riding alone. Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "Are you tracking me?" Quincy looked genuinely surprised. "No, madam." "Like I said, I'm heading to Denver for work." He paused, studying her face in the firelight. "But I get the feeling someone might be." The honesty in his expression made her hesitate. It had been so long since she'd had a real conversation with another person. Years of solitude and fear had left her starved for human connection, even as she feared it. "Yes," she admitted finally, "someone is." Quincy didn't press for details. Instead, he reached for a stick and poked at the fire, sending sparks swirling upward into the darkness. "World's full of troubles," he said quietly. "Most folks are running from something or other, just not all of us have to do it on foot." The simple understanding in his words cracked something inside her, a hard shell of isolation that had been building for 5 years. Before she could stop herself, tears were slipping down her cheeks, silent but unstoppable. Quincy pretended not to notice, giving her the dignity of privacy while remaining close enough that she wasn't alone with her grief. When she finally wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, he offered her a surprisingly clean handkerchief without comment. "Thank you," she whispered, "not just for the cloth. Night's getting colder," he observed. "Fire could use more wood." As if by unspoken agreement, they both rose to gather fallen branches from the surrounding area. When they returned, the fire built up and crackling merrily. Quincy unrolled his bedroll on one side of the fire while Grace settled on the other. "I'll take first watch," he offered. "You look like you could use some real sleep." Grace's instincts warred within her. Trust had nearly gotten her killed more than once, and yet exhaustion pulled at her like quicksand. If this man had wanted to harm her, he'd had ample opportunity. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You don't even know me." Quincy settled his back against a boulder, his revolver now within easy reach. "My pa always said a man's measure is taken by how he treats those who can't do anything for him." He glanced over at her. "Though I suspect you could do plenty for yourself if you weren't dead on your feet." Despite her wariness, Grace felt her lips curve into the ghost of a smile. It had been so long since she'd experienced even this small act of kindness that she hardly knew how to respond. "I'm Grace," she said finally, offering her real name for the first time in years, Grace Norton. If he recognized the name from the wanted posters, he gave no indication. Pleased to meet you properly, Miss Norton. Now get some rest. Dawn comes early in these mountains. Against all odds and her own fierce self-preservation, Grace found herself drifting into the deepest sleep she'd had in years, lulled by the crackling fire and the quiet, steady presence of the cowboy across from her. She woke to the smell of coffee brewing over a freshly built fire. The sun was just beginning to illuminate the eastern sky, painting the clouds in shades of pink and gold. For a moment, disorientation seized her. She never slept past first light, but then the events of the previous night came rushing back. Quincy was crouched by the fire, pouring dark coffee into a tin cup. His horse was saddled and ready nearby, but he showed no signs of immediate departure. "Morning," he greeted her, offering the cup. "Hope I didn't wake you." Grace accepted the coffee gratefully, its rich aroma making her stomach rumble. "You didn't," she said, then added with some surprise, "I slept through the night, figured you needed it." He was frying something in a small pan that smelled heavenly. "Got some bacon to go with the last of the hardtack. Not exactly a hotel breakfast, but it'll keep you going." As they ate, Grace found herself studying Quincy more carefully in the daylight. His face was tanned and weathered, with fine lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of squinting into the sun. A thin scar ran along his jawline, and his hands were rough and calloused. Everything about him spoke of a life lived outdoors, facing whatever came his way. "Where are you from?" she asked, surprising herself with her curiosity. "Originally, Tennessee, left after the war." Something passed across his face, a shadow of old pain. "Been working cattle drives since '65, Texas to Kansas mostly, though I've been pushing farther west lately." "And now Denver," he nodded. "Cattle operation outside the city. Foreman, there's an old army buddy, says they need experienced hands who can handle themselves and the stock." He glanced at her. "What about you? Where are you heading?" The familiar tension returned to Grace's shoulders. "Wherever's safe." Quincy didn't immediately respond, just sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "Those men who are after you," he finally said. "They close by." Grace stiffened. "How did you saw a sign of riders yesterday? 3 men pushing their horses hard, not typical behavior unless they're chasing something." He set down his cup, or someone. Grace's hand went instinctively to the knife at her belt. "I should go." "Probably," Quincy agreed, surprising her, "but running blind isn't always the best plan." "I don't have much choice." He studied her for a long moment. "There's always a choice, Miss Norton. Sometimes it's just between bad and worse." The way he said it matter of fact, but without judgment, made Grace pause. 5 years of running alone had narrowed her thinking to mere survival. She hadn't considered alternatives in a long time. "What would you suggest?" she asked cautiously. Quincy leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Denver's a growing city. Lots of people, lots of work. Easier to disappear in a crowd than out here where any rider can spot a lone woman from miles away." He hesitated. "I could take you there." Safer traveling together. Grace's first instinct was to refuse. Traveling with a man would only attract more attention, and she had learned to trust only herself. But the practical part of her mind, the part that had kept her alive these 5 years, recognized the logic in what he said. "These men after you," Quincy continued when she didn't immediately respond. "They lawmen." "No," she said firmly. "Bounty hunters. After reward money then, not justice." She looked at him sharply. "You know who I am?" Quincy met her gaze steadily. "I can read, Miss Norton. Seen the posters." "Don't put much stock in them, though. Innocent folks get accused of all manner of things out here." His calm acceptance stunned her. "You don't know what I've done. True enough. But I know what I've seen: a woman alone who could have stuck a knife in me while I slept but didn't. Who shares her fire and her fish with a stranger." He stood up, dusting off his pants. "That tells me more than any poster." Grace felt something unfamiliar expanding in her chest, a fragile hope she barely recognized. "If I go to Denver with you, what then?" "Then you decide. Stay, move on, whatever suits you." He began breaking down their small camp, kicking dirt over the fire. "I'm just offering safe passage, nothing more, nothing more." The words should have reassured her, but instead they brought an unexpected twinge of disappointment. Grace pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the practical aspects of his offer. "Your horse can't carry double for that distance." Quincy's mouth quirked in a half-smile. "No, but we can alternate riding and walking. Make better time than you would on foot, and I'd make better time than pushing straight through." He glanced toward the horizon. "Plus, those hunters are expecting a woman alone, not a couple traveling together." The logic was sound. Denver offered anonymity that the wilderness couldn't. And something about this quiet cowboy with his straightforward manner made her want to trust him, despite years of learned caution. "All right," she finally agreed. "To Denver." The relief in his eyes was genuine, which surprised her. "Good decision," was all he said as he finished packing his gear. Within the hour, they were heading northwest. Grace perched somewhat awkwardly in the saddle while Quincy led the horse on foot. They had agreed to switch positions every few hours to spare both the horse and Quincy's legs. As they traveled, Grace remained vigilant, scanning the horizon constantly for signs of pursuit. By midday, she began to relax slightly. There was no sign of the bounty hunters, and the steady rhythm of travel was almost soothing after so many years of constant flight. How long till Denver? She asked during one of their brief rest stops. 3 days if the weather holds, Quincy replied, squinting at the sky. Might be pushing it if those clouds mean what I think they do. Grace followed his gaze to see dark clouds gathering over the mountains to the west. Storm coming. Looks that way, early for snow, but the mountains make their own weather. He offered her his canteen. We'll need shelter if it hits. There's an old trapper's cabin about half a day's ride from here if memory serves, might be our best bet. The idea of being confined in a cabin with a man she barely knew should have terrified her, but Grace found herself nodding in agreement. Something about Quincy Grayson inspired confidence, a steadiness that suggested he was exactly what he appeared to be. They pushed on as the clouds continued to build, the temperature dropping noticeably as the afternoon wore on. By the time the first fat snowflakes began to fall, they had reached the small clearing where the trapper's cabin stood. It was a crude structure, little more than 4 walls of rough-hewn logs with a sagging roof and a stone chimney, but it was solid enough to provide shelter from the rapidly deteriorating weather. "Not exactly the Brown Palace Hotel," Quincy commented as he pushed open the door, referring to Denver's most luxurious accommodation. "But it'll keep us dry." The interior was dusty but intact. A rudimentary stone fireplace dominated one wall, and rough wooden platforms that served as beds lined another. Animal pelts hung from pegs, left behind by the cabin's original owner. While Quincy tended to his horse in the small lean-to attached to the cabin, Grace set about making the space habitable. Years of making camp had taught her efficiency. By the time Quincy returned, stomping snow from his boots, she had swept the worst of the dust away and was arranging kindling in the fireplace. "You've done this before," he observed, shrugging out of his snow-dusted coat. Grace struck a match to the kindling. "Many times." As the fire caught and began to warm the small space, they settled into a surprisingly comfortable routine. Quincy contributed the last of his provisions: jerky, coffee, and a handful of potatoes that had been nestled in his saddlebag. Grace had some wild onions she'd gathered during their journey. Together, they made a simple but satisfying stew that bubbled in Quincy's small camp pot over the fire. Outside, the snow continued to fall, the wind occasionally howling around the corners of the cabin like a living thing. The storm had fully arrived, transforming the landscape into a swirling white void. "Looks like we made the right call," Quincy said, peering through a gap in the shutters. "Wouldn't want to be caught out in this." Grace nodded, acutely aware of how close disaster had come. If she had continued alone, on foot, she shivered at the thought. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for bringing me here." Quincy turned from the window, his expression softening. Seemed like the decent thing to do. As they ate their stew by firelight, the wind creating a constant backdrop of sound, Grace found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years. The cabin was secure, the fire was warm, and for the first time in a very long time she wasn't alone. "How long have you been running?" Quincy asked after they had finished eating, his voice gentle but direct. Grace stiffened slightly, then consciously relaxed. If he had meant her harm, he'd had plenty of opportunities. 5 years, she answered honestly. Since I was 23, Quincy let out a low whistle. Long time to be on your own. Yes. She stared into the fire, memories surfacing despite her efforts to keep them buried. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Rarely is. He leaned back against the wall, stretching his long legs toward the hearth. Mind if I ask what happened? Those posters say murder, but you don't believe them. Grace gave him a sad smile. Maybe you should. Maybe, but I'd rather hear your version first. The simple offer to tell her story, to be heard, was almost overwhelming. Grace found herself speaking before she had consciously decided to do so, the words spilling out like water from a broken dam. My father was a businessman in St. Louis, not wealthy but respected. He invested everything in a venture with Benjamin Whitaker, a man everyone trusted. Her hands clenched in her lap. When father died suddenly, I discovered discrepancies in the accounts. Whitaker had been embezzling funds for years, not just from my father but from dozens of investors. Quincy listened silently, his blue eyes never leaving her face. I confronted him with evidence, Grace continued. He laughed at me, said no one would believe a woman over him. She swallowed hard. I left his office furious but determined to expose him. I was halfway home when I realized I'd forgotten my father's ledger, the most damning evidence. When I returned, he was dead, Quincy finished quietly. Grace nodded. Shot through the heart. His partners arrived moments after I did, found me standing over the body. They claimed I murdered him over a business disagreement. Her voice grew bitter. The gun had my fingerprints on it. I had supposedly handled it earlier when Whitaker was showing me his collection. You were framed. Perfectly. She reached for her small pack, withdrawing the worn leather diary. All the evidence is here, the accounting discrepancies, notes about meetings, everything that proves Whitaker and his partners were defrauding investors. But no one would listen. The partners were influential men with powerful friends, so you ran. I escaped from custody the night before the trial was to begin. One of the guards believed my story, or perhaps he just pitied me. Grace's expression hardened. I've been running ever since. The reward for my capture has kept the bounty hunters interested all these years. Quincy was silent for a long moment, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the small cabin. That's a heavy burden to carry alone, he finally said. Grace had expected disbelief, questions, or at the very least, caution. His simple acceptance nearly undid her. Why do you believe me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He considered her question seriously. I've met my share of killers. They don't look at the world the way you do. His mouth curved in a slight smile. Besides, lying takes energy. You're too practical to waste it on made-up stories. A surprised laugh escaped her, the first genuine laugh in so long she couldn't remember the last time. That's an unusual way of looking at it. I'm an unusual man, he replied with a self-deprecating shrug. As the evening wore on and the storm continued to rage outside, they talked. Really talked, in a way Grace had forgotten was possible. Quincy told her about growing up in Tennessee, about fighting for the Union despite coming from a southern state, about the cattle drives that had taken him across the vast expanse of the Western Territories. What made you decide to settle in Denver? She asked as the fire burned low. Tired of always moving, he admitted. Wanted to put down some roots, build something that lasts. There was a wistfulness in his voice that resonated with something deep inside her. I understand that, Grace said softly. Sometimes I can barely remember what it feels like to belong somewhere. Their eyes met across the dimming firelight, and something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits despite their different paths. You should get some sleep, Quincy said eventually, breaking the moment. I'll keep watch. You need rest too, Grace protested. I'll wake you in a few hours to take your turn, he promised. Old habits die hard, never could sleep well during a storm anyway. Grace reluctantly wrapped herself in one of the musty furs and settled on the rough platform bed. Despite the unfamiliar surroundings, sleep came quickly, her body surrendering to exhaustion with the knowledge that, for once, someone else was keeping watch. She woke several hours later to find the cabin dark except for the faint glow of embers in the fireplace. For a moment, panic seized her. Had Quincy left? But then she made out his form, silhouetted against the shuttered window where he stood peering out at the night. "Storm's letting up," he said without turning, somehow aware that she was awake. "Stars coming out." Grace sat up, pushing the fur aside. "I can take over the watch now." He glanced back at her, his face half in shadow. "No need, couldn't sleep anyway." She moved to stand beside him at the window, peering through the crack in the shutters. The night sky was clearing, stars emerging like diamonds against black velvet. The snow had transformed the landscape into something ethereal and pristine. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Yes," Quincy agreed, but when Grace looked up, she found him watching her rather than the vista outside. The intensity in his gaze should have frightened her, but instead, it sent a different kind of shiver through her body, one that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the sudden awareness of him as a man, not just a traveling companion. "Quincy," she began, uncertain what she even wanted to say. He stepped back slightly, breaking the moment. "Should get some more sleep," he said, his voice rough. "We've got ground to cover tomorrow if the weather holds." Grace nodded, returning to her makeshift bed even as her mind whirled with confused emotions. It had been so long since she'd allowed herself to feel anything beyond the constant vigilance necessary for survival. The unexpected attraction was as disorienting as it was unwelcome. Sleep eluded her for some time, her thoughts circling back to the cowboy who now sat by the fire, feeding it small sticks to maintain the warmth in the cabin. What did she really know about him, beyond the story he'd told her? Why had he really offered to help her? And why did her heart race every time their eyes met? When she finally drifted off again, her dreams were a confused jumble of running, hiding, and a pair of steady blue eyes that promised something she didn't dare name. Morning brought clarity in the form of brilliant sunshine reflecting off pristine snow. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind a transformed world of white that glittered like crushed diamonds under the cold blue sky. "We should get moving," Quincy said as they shared a breakfast of coffee and the last scraps of food. "Snow won't slow us down much yet, but if another storm comes through." Grace nodded, gathering her meager belongings with practiced efficiency. The confusion of the previous night had resolved itself into a firm determination. She would accompany Quincy to Denver, then continue on her own. Attachment was a luxury she couldn't afford, no matter how appealing the prospect might be. They set out just after dawn, the horse picking its way carefully through the fresh snow. The air was crisp and clean, their breath forming small clouds in front of their faces. Despite the cold, Grace felt strangely invigorated, as if the storm had washed away some of the weariness that had been her constant companion for years. "See those mountains?" Quincy pointed to the west, where peaks rose sharp and clear against the horizon. "Other side of those is Denver. We'll start seeing signs of civilization by tomorrow afternoon if we make good time." Grace studied the distant mountains with mixed emotions. Denver represented safety of a sort, anonymity in a busy, growing city where she might finally stop running, at least for a while. But it also meant the end of this unexpected interlude with Quincy Grayson, a man who had shown her more kindness in 2 days than she had experienced in 5 long years. They traveled steadily throughout the day, alternating between riding and walking to spare the horse. The snow slowed their progress somewhat, but the clear weather was a blessing after the previous day's storm. As they made camp that evening in a sheltered grove of pine trees, Grace found herself watching Quincy as he cared for his horse before seeing to their campfire. There was something compelling about the easy competence with which he moved, the quiet confidence that seemed to be his most fundamental characteristic. "Something on your mind?" he asked, catching her gaze as he returned to the fire. Grace looked away, embarrassed to be caught staring. "Just thinking about Denver," she lied, "wondering what it's like now." Growing fast, Quincy settled beside the fire, closer to her than was strictly necessary. "Railroads brought all kinds of people, merchants, miners, families looking for a fresh start. Is that what you're looking for?" "A fresh start," he considered the question seriously, poking at the fire with a stick. "Suppose I am, in a way, war changes a man, makes him see things differently," He glanced at her. Guess you understand something about that, not the war, but the changing. Grace nodded slowly. Yes. I'm not the same person I was in St. Louis. Better or worse, harder, she admitted. Stronger in some ways, broken in others. Quincy's gaze was steady, not broken, just reshaped, like metal in a forge. The simple metaphor struck her with unexpected force. She had thought of herself as damaged for so long that the alternative view was almost shocking. You really believe that? She asked softly. I do. He held her gaze, something warm and unguarded in his expression. Adversity doesn't just destroy Grace. Sometimes it reveals what was always there, the strength, the courage. The use of her first name, spoken with such quiet certainty, sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. Something was building between them, something fragile and unexpected that frightened her even as it drew her in. We should get some sleep, she said abruptly, pulling back from emotions she wasn't ready to confront. If Quincy was disappointed by her retreat, he didn't show it. I'll take first watch, he offered as he had the previous night. This time, Grace insisted on taking her turn, and they divided the night between them. When it was her watch, she sat wrapped in a blanket, gazing at Quincy's sleeping form and wondering why, after 5 years of learning to trust no one, this man had so quickly become an exception. The next day brought them within sight of the first outlying farms and ranches that surrounded Denver. Signs of civilization appeared with increasing frequency: fenced pastures, rutted wagon roads, occasional columns of smoke from distant chimneys. Should reach the city by nightfall, Quincy observed as they paused to rest the horse at midday. Plenty of boarding houses where you could find a room. Grace felt a pang at the casual way he outlined their impending separation. What about you? Where will you go? Ranch is about 5 miles outside the city limits. Foreman knows I'm coming. He hesitated. But I'll see you settled first. The concern in his voice warmed her even as it emphasized the temporary nature of their arrangement. That's not necessary. Maybe not, but I'm doing it anyway. His tone brooked no argument. City can be dangerous for a woman alone, especially one who's not familiar with the place. Grace wanted to protest that she had survived far worse than a city's dangers, but the truth was that she was touched by his concern. All right, she conceded. Thank you. As they continued their journey, the landscape gradually transformed from open wilderness to cultivated fields and small homesteads. Grace found herself growing increasingly tense as they encountered other travelers on the road, a wagon loaded with farm goods, a pair of riders headed in the opposite direction, a mail coach thundering past. Quincy noticed her discomfort. Keep your head down, he advised quietly. Most folks won't look twice at a man and woman traveling together. Nothing unusual about that. She nodded, pulling the borrowed scarf higher around her face. The wanted posters had circulated widely, but 5 years was a long time. Her appearance had changed. She was thinner, her once smooth hands calloused, her skin weathered by exposure. Still, caution had kept her alive this long. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Denver appeared before them, a sprawling collection of buildings nestled in the broad valley, smoke rising from countless chimneys against the darkening sky. Even from a distance, Grace could see that it was much larger than when she had passed through briefly in the early days of her flight. Quite a sight, isn't it? Quincy remarked, reining in his horse to take in the view. It's grown, Grace observed, a mixture of hope and trepidation churning inside her. The larger the city, the easier it would be to disappear into anonymity. But cities also meant law enforcement, more people who might recognize her from the posters. Railroads changed everything, Quincy explained as they continued down the road toward the city limits. Brings in supplies, people, money. Denver's becoming a real city, not just a mining camp anymore. Grace listened as he pointed out landmarks: the territorial capital, building under construction, the area where businesses clustered, the streets where respectable boarding houses could be found. His knowledge reassured her. He clearly knew the city well. Dusk was settling as they reached the outskirts of Denver. Gas lamps were being lit along the main streets, casting pools of yellow light that pushed back the gathering darkness. The sidewalks were busy with people heading home after the day's business or venturing out for evening entertainments. Quincy guided them down a side street away from the main thoroughfare. "Know a decent place over on Larimer Street," he said. "Run by a widow who doesn't ask too many questions as long as you pay on time." Grace nodded gratefully, pulling her scarf closer as they passed a pair of uniformed policemen. Her heart hammered in her chest, but the men barely glanced at them, just another couple arriving in the city as night fell. The boarding house was a narrow, 3-story building with clean curtains in the windows and a freshly swept stoop. Quincy dismounted and helped Grace down, his hands lingering at her waist slightly longer than necessary. "Wait here," he said, tying his horse to the hitching post. "I'll see if Mrs. Calloway has a room available." Grace waited nervously on the sidewalk, trying to look inconspicuous while scanning the street for potential threats. Denver was both familiar and foreign. She had passed through early in her flight west, but hadn't stayed long, fearing it was too obvious a destination for someone fleeing St. Louis. Quincy returned a few minutes later, nodding in satisfaction. "She has a room on the 2nd floor. Clean, private, reasonable rate." He hesitated. "I told her you were my sister, recently widowed. Thought that might explain why you're traveling light." The lie was sensible, giving her a ready-made explanation for her circumstances. "Thank you," Grace said softly, "for everything." A shadow passed across his face. "Let's get you settled." Mrs. Calloway proved to be a brisk, practical woman in her 50s who showed Grace to a small but clean room without excessive curiosity. The room contained a narrow bed, a washstand with pitcher and bowl, a small writing desk, and a wardrobe, simple accommodations, but luxurious compared to what Grace had known for years. "Breakfast at 7, Mrs. Calloway informed her. "Kitchen closes at 8. No gentlemen callers in rooms, but your brother is welcome in the parlor until 9. With that, she departed, leaving Grace and Quincy standing awkwardly in the small space. "It's perfect," Grace said, running her hand over the quilt that covered the bed. A real bed with sheets and pillows, it seemed almost unimaginable after so long. Quincy remained near the door, hat in his hands. "I paid for 2 weeks, he said, avoiding her eyes. "Should give you time to find your feet, maybe look for work if you're planning to stay." The finality in his voice struck her like a physical blow. "You're leaving now," he nodded, still not meeting her gaze. "Need to report to the ranch, already delayed by the storm." Of course. Their arrangement had been clear from the beginning, safe passage to Denver, nothing more. Grace had no right to feel this hollow ache at the thought of him walking out the door. "I understand," she said, forcing a smile. "I can't thank you enough for your help." Quincy finally looked at her, something unreadable in his blue eyes. "You'll be all right here. Denver's a good place to make a fresh start." "Yes," she agreed, though the prospect suddenly seemed much less appealing than it had before. "I'm sure it is." He took a step toward the door, then paused, turning back. "If you need anything." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper, placing it on the small desk. "Address of the ranch. It's the Circle G, owned by a man named Harrington." Grace nodded, throat too tight for words. This was how it had to be, how it should be. She had no place in his life, and he couldn't be part of her uncertain future. Yet something rebellious inside her wanted to reach out, to ask him to stay, to see if the connection that had sparked between them could grow into something more. "Goodbye, Grace," Quincy said softly, settling his hat on his head. "Take care of yourself." "Goodbye, Quincy," she managed, "and thank you for believing me." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Wasn't hard to do." With that, he was gone, his footsteps receding down the hallway. Grace sank onto the edge of the bed, a strange emptiness expanding inside her chest. She had been alone for 5 years, yet somehow the solitude had never felt as acute as it did in this moment. Outside, she heard the clip-clop of hooves as Quincy rode away, taking with him the brief sense of connection that had sustained her these past few days. Practicality reasserted itself quickly. She needed to plan, to figure out how to survive in Denver without attracting attention, to find work that would allow her to remain anonymous. Grace washed in the tepid water from the pitcher, changed into her spare dress, and went downstairs to the dining room where a simple supper was being served to the boarding house residents. She ate mechanically, barely tasting the food while maintaining a polite distance from the other boarders' curious glances and occasional attempts at conversation. That night, lying in a real bed for the first time in years, Grace found sleep elusive despite her exhaustion. Her mind kept returning to Quincy, his steady presence, his quiet strength, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. It was foolish to dwell on him, she knew. Their paths had crossed briefly and now diverged. That was the way of things in this vast, unforgiving land. Yet as she finally drifted off to sleep, his words echoed in her mind, "Rest with me." For a few precious days, she had done just that, finding a peace she had thought forever lost. The next morning, Grace rose early and set about the business of remaking herself once again. She had done it before transformed from Grace Norton, respected daughter of a St. Louis businessman, to a nameless fugitive living off the land. Now she would become someone new, perhaps Grace Nichols, a widow seeking a fresh start in the bustling frontier city. Mrs. Calloway proved to be a valuable source of information about Denver and its opportunities. Girl with decent manners and a good hand can find work as a shop assistant or perhaps in one of the better hotels, she advised over breakfast, though they'll want references. References Grace didn't have, of course, but she had learned to forge documents when necessary, and her handwriting had once been praised by her finishing school instructors. By midday, she had created a simple letter of recommendation supposedly from a Kansas City employer, attesting to her reliability and good character. Armed with this and her story of widowhood, Grace ventured into the city. Denver was both intimidating and exhilarating after so long in the wilderness. The streets teemed with activity, wagons laden with goods, smartly dressed businessmen, ladies in fashionable attire, workers, gamblers, and everything in between. The noise and bustle were overwhelming at first, but Grace gradually adjusted, remembering how to move through a crowd without drawing attention. Her first attempts at finding employment were unsuccessful. The larger hotels wanted experienced staff, and the shops seemed fully staffed for the approaching holiday season. By late afternoon, Grace was beginning to worry about what would happen when the 2 weeks of paid lodging ran out. It was as she was passing a small bookshop on a side street that opportunity presented itself. A handwritten sign in the window read simply, "Assistant wanted. Inquire within." The shop was narrow but deep, shelves crammed with books extending from floor to ceiling. The smell of paper, leather, and dust brought back memories of her father's library, one of the few genuinely happy associations from her former life. A bell tinkled as she entered, and a moment later, an elderly man appeared from behind a curtain at the rear of the shop. He was small and slightly stooped, with wispy white hair and spectacles perched on his nose. "Good afternoon," he greeted her. "Looking for something in particular?" "Actually, I noticed your sign," Grace replied, "about needing an assistant." The old man peered at her over his spectacles. "You have experience with books. My father had an extensive library. I helped catalog and maintain it. This, at least, was completely true. I'm very comfortable with books and I learn quickly." He studied her for a long moment. "What brings you to Denver, young lady?" Grace gave him the story she had prepared, recently widowed, seeking a fresh start away from painful memories. It was close enough to the truth to be convincing. The bookseller introduced himself as Arthur Pemberton, originally from Boston but a resident of Denver for nearly a decade. "Hours are long, pay is modest, work can be dusty," he warned. "Many of these volumes haven't been properly cataloged in years." "That wouldn't bother me at all, Mr. Pemberton, and I'll need to see some form of reference." Grace produced her forged letter, heart pounding as he examined it carefully. After what seemed an eternity, he nodded and handed it back. "Can you start tomorrow, Mrs. Nichols?" 8 o'clock sharp, relief washed over her. "Yes, of course, thank you, Mr. Pemberton." As she left the bookshop, Grace felt a cautious optimism taking root. A job, respectable lodging, perhaps Denver could indeed be the fresh start Quincy had suggested. The thought of him brought the now familiar ache, but she pushed it aside. She had survived 5 years alone. She could certainly manage without a cowboy she had known for mere days. The following weeks established a routine that was both comforting and strange after so long without structure. Grace rose early, breakfasted at the boarding house, and spent her days organizing, cataloging, and selling books at Pemberton's shop. The old bookseller proved to be knowledgeable and kind, if somewhat eccentric, and the work itself was satisfying. In the evenings, she would return to her small room, eat supper in the boarding house dining room, and occasionally exchange pleasantries with the other residents, mostly respectable working women like herself, along with a few elderly gentlemen. It was a quiet, careful existence, but compared to the years of constant flight, it felt like luxury. Yet despite the relative security, Grace remained vigilant. She scanned every newspaper for mentions of her case, startled at every lawman who entered the bookshop, and avoided the busier parts of the city where bounty hunters might congregate. The fear that had been her constant companion for 5 years couldn't be discarded so easily. And then there was Quincy. Though she tried not to think of him, he invaded her thoughts at the most unexpected moments, when she cataloged a book about cattle ranching, when she overheard customers discussing the growing beef industry outside Denver, when the rare snowfall reminded her of the storm they had weathered together in the trapper's cabin. Several times she found herself taking out the paper with the Circle G Ranch address, wondering what would happen if she sent a note, just to let him know she was well. Each time she put it away again, reminding herself that attachment was a luxury she couldn't afford. December arrived, bringing colder weather and preparations for Christmas throughout the city. Mr. Pemberton decorated the bookshop with evergreen boughs and red ribbons, and business increased as people sought gifts for loved ones. The festive atmosphere only heightened Grace's sense of isolation, reminding her of holidays long past when she had been surrounded by family. It was during this time, nearly a month after her arrival in Denver, that the past finally caught up with her. She was helping a customer find a particular volume of poetry when the bell above the shop door rang. Grace glanced up automatically, then froze as recognition slammed into her like a physical blow. Samuel Radcliffe, one of Whitaker's partners, one of the men who had framed her for murder, stood in the doorway, brushing snow from his expensive coat. 5 years had added gray to his hair and weight to his frame, but there was no mistaking him. Grace ducked behind a bookshelf, heart hammering so loudly she was certain everyone in the shop must hear it. "Ah, Mr. Radcliffe," she heard Mr. Pemberton greet the newcomer. "Your special order arrived yesterday. Let me fetch it for you." Grace pressed herself against the shelves, mind racing. If Radcliffe saw her, everything would be over. He would recognize her instantly, call the authorities, and all the fragile security she had built would crumble. The shop wasn't large enough to hide effectively, and the only exit was past the front counter where Radcliffe now stood, chatting amiably with Mr. Pemberton as the old man wrapped a book in brown paper. "Excellent volume, sir," Pemberton was saying. "First edition, as you requested." "Will you be staying in Denver long?" "Just until the new year," Radcliffe replied. "Business interests to attend to. The railroad has opened up remarkable opportunities out here." His voice, cultured, confident, utterly without remorse, sent shivers of rage and fear through Grace. This man had helped destroy her life, and here he was prospering, expanding his business interests while she had spent 5 years running for her life. Grace inched toward the curtain that separated the shop from the storeroom, praying she could slip away unnoticed. Just a few more steps. "Mrs. Nichols," Mr. Pemberton called. "Could you help with this invoice?" She froze, trapped between discovery and suspicious behavior. Taking a deep breath, she pulled a book from the shelf and held it in front of her face as she moved toward the counter, keeping her head down and angling away from Radcliffe. "Just a moment, sir," she murmured, voice deliberately pitched lower than usual. Without looking up, she took the invoice from Mr. Pemberton and made a show of examining it intently. Radcliffe seemed not to notice her, continuing his conversation about business prospects in the West. Grace could feel cold sweat trickling down her back as she pretended to work, every muscle tense with the need to flee. After what seemed an eternity, Radcliffe paid for his purchase and moved toward the door. "Good day, Pemberton. I'll stop by next week to see those other volumes you mentioned." "Looking forward to it, sir," the bookseller replied cheerfully. The moment the door closed behind Radcliffe, Grace's knees nearly buckled with relief. But the brief encounter had shattered her sense of security completely. If Radcliffe was in Denver, it was no longer safe for her. "Are you feeling well, Mrs. Nichols?" Mr. Pemberton asked, peering at her with concern. "You've gone quite pale." "Just a momentary dizziness," she assured him, though her mind was already calculating how quickly she could gather her few belongings and leave the city. "I'll be fine." But she wouldn't be fine, and she knew it. After a month of believing she might actually build a life in Denver, she was back where she started running, hiding, looking over her shoulder. The familiar despair threatened to overwhelm her. That evening, Grace packed her small bag with mechanical efficiency. She would leave at dawn, before the boarding house stirred. Head west, perhaps, toward the mining towns in the mountains where few questions were asked about a person's past. As she folded her spare dress, her fingers brushed against the paper with the Circle G Ranch address. She pulled it out, staring at Quincy's precise handwriting. "If you need anything," he had said. But this was far more than anything. This was her life unraveling yet again, the past reaching out with inexorable fingers to drag her back into the nightmare. Could she involve him in her troubles? The rational part of her mind said no, it would be unfair, perhaps even dangerous for him. Yet something else, something that had been growing steadily since that first night by the fire, whispered that if anyone could help, if anyone would understand, it was Quincy Grayson. Decision made, Grace quickly penned a note explaining Radcliffe's appearance and her need to leave Denver immediately. She didn't ask for help directly, couldn't bring herself to place that burden on him, but simply informed him that she was moving on and thanked him again for his kindness. Early the next morning, she paid her bill at the boarding house, leaving a note for Mr. Pemberton apologizing for her abrupt departure and citing a family emergency. Then, with her small pack secured, she slipped out into the pre-dawn darkness and headed toward the livery stable where she had arranged to rent a horse the previous evening. The streets were quiet, most of Denver still asleep under a light dusting of fresh snow. Grace moved swiftly, alert for any sign of danger. Her first stop would be the Circle G Ranch, not to stay, but at least to deliver the note in person. After that, she would figure it out as she went, as she always had. The livery stable was just opening as she arrived, a sleepy stable boy leading out her rented horse, a sturdy bay mare with a white blaze. Grace paid the agreed-upon fee and secured her pack behind the saddle. "Heading out early, madam," the boy observed through a yawn. "Yes," Grace replied shortly, not encouraging conversation. "Which road leads to the Circle G Ranch?" He pointed west. "Follow the main road out of town about 5 miles, then look for the split-rail fence with the branded gate. Can't miss it, one of the biggest spreads in the area." Grace nodded her thanks and mounted, guiding the mare through the quiet streets toward the western edge of the city. As Denver fell behind her and the open country spread out ahead, a familiar tension eased from her shoulders. Whatever happened next, at least she was moving, not waiting like a trapped animal for discovery. The sun was just cresting the eastern horizon when she spotted the Circle G gate in the distance. The ranch was indeed substantial, a large main house, several outbuildings, corrals, and fenced pastures stretching as far as she could see. A curl of smoke rose from the chimney of what appeared to be a bunkhouse. Grace hesitated at the gate, uncertainty suddenly assailing her. What if Quincy wasn't here? What if he didn't want to see her? What if her presence brought trouble to his doorstep? Before she could decide whether to continue or turn back, the decision was made for her. A rider emerged from one of the corrals and headed in her direction, a familiar figure on a chestnut gelding. Quincy reined in his horse a few yards away, surprise evident on his face. "Grace." She straightened in her saddle, suddenly acutely aware of how this must appear showing up unannounced at dawn after a month of silence. "I was just leaving a note," she explained, withdrawing the folded paper from her pocket. "I didn't mean to disturb you." He dismounted in one fluid motion, approaching her mare slowly as if afraid she might bolt. "What's happened?" The genuine concern in his voice broke through her carefully maintained composure. "One of them is here in Denver," she said, her voice catching. "Radcliffe. One of Whitaker's partners who framed me. He came into the bookshop yesterday." Understanding dawned in Quincy's eyes. "So you're running again." It wasn't a question, but she nodded anyway. "I have to, if he sees me." Quincy was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady on her face. "Where will you go?" West, I thought. "The mining towns, maybe." Even to her own ears, the plan sounded desperate and ill-conceived. He shook his head slightly. "Those towns are rough places, especially for a woman alone." "I don't have many options," Grace replied, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "I never do." Quincy stepped closer, one hand reaching up to rest on her mare's neck. "Yes, you do," he said quietly. "You can stay here." Grace stared at him in disbelief. "Here at the ranch." "Ranch is big, plenty of work. No one would think to look for you here." He held her gaze, something intense and unreadable in his blue eyes. "Unless you'd rather keep running." The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that for a moment Grace couldn't find words to respond. "I can't ask that of you," she finally managed. "If they trace me here, you'd be harboring a fugitive." "You didn't ask, I offered." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "And I'm pretty good at weighing risks, Grace, have been since the war." The simplicity of his statement, the quiet certainty behind it, stirred something deep inside her, a fragile hope she had almost forgotten could exist. "Why would you do this?" she asked softly. Quincy's expression softened. "Because in all my years of riding the trails, I've never met anyone who deserved a rest more than you do." He paused, then added more quietly, "And because I haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the day we rode into Denver." The admission hung in the air between them, as momentous as it was understated. Grace felt a flush spread across her cheeks, her heart suddenly racing with something other than fear. "I've thought of you too," she confessed, the words escaping before she could reconsider. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, something new and tentative taking shape in the space between them. Then Quincy held out his hand. "Come inside," he said. "We'll figure this out together." Grace hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. The warmth of his fingers around hers felt like an anchor in a storm, tossed, see something solid to hold onto when everything else was uncertain. "All right," she said. "Together." The main house of the Circle G was a substantial two-story structure built of sturdy logs and river stone. Inside, it was simply but comfortably furnished, with a large stone fireplace dominating the main room. Grace stood awkwardly just inside the door as Quincy stoked the fire to drive away the early morning chill. "Boss is away in Kansas City," he explained, gesturing for her to take a seat at the large oak table that occupied one end of the room. "Won't be back until after New Year's. And the other workers?" Grace asked, removing her gloves but keeping her coat on, still half expecting to need to flee at any moment. "Bunkhouse is separate. Foreman's cabin is down by the corrals." Quincy moved to the kitchen area, pumping water into a kettle and setting it on the stove. "No one comes to the main house except by invitation." As he prepared coffee and set out some bread and preserved fruit, Grace gradually began to relax enough to take in her surroundings. The house was clearly a bachelor's domain, functional rather than decorative, but surprisingly clean and orderly. "Mr. Harrington must trust you a great deal," she observed, "to leave you in charge of his home." Quincy set 2 steaming mugs of coffee on the table and sat across from her. "Known him since the war. He was my commanding officer. Good man." He pushed one of the mugs toward her. "Drink." "You look half frozen." Grace wrapped her cold fingers around the mug gratefully. The normalcy of the moment sitting at a table, drinking coffee, was both comforting and surreal after the panic of the previous day. "Now," Quincy said after she had taken a few sips, "tell me exactly what happened with this Radcliffe fellow." Grace recounted the encounter at the bookshop, the fear that had gripped her, and her hasty decision to leave Denver. As she spoke, Quincy listened intently, his expression thoughtful. "He didn't see you?" he asked when she had finished. "I don't think so. I kept my head down and my back turned." Quincy nodded slowly. "So he doesn't know you're in Denver, but you can't go back to the bookshop or the boarding house?" "No." Grace stared into her coffee. "I've lost everything." "Again?" "Not everything," Quincy said quietly. She looked up to find his gaze steady on her face, something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Before she could respond, he continued, "We need a plan. A better one than you just running blindly west." The "we" in his statement wrapped around her like a warm blanket. For so long there had only been her alone against the world. The idea that someone else was willing to share her burden was almost too much to comprehend. "What sort of plan?" she asked. Quincy leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Two options as I see it. First, you stay here at the ranch. Work as a housekeeper, keep out of sight when anyone from town visits." He paused. "Second option is to deal with Radcliffe more directly." Grace stiffened. "What do you mean?" "You said the evidence against him is in your diary. What if we found a way to use it?" "I've tried," Grace said bitterly. "No one would listen. These men are powerful, connected. Maybe you were talking to the wrong people." Quincy's expression was thoughtful. "Denver's growing up. Getting more civilized, has a real newspaper now, proper courts." Hope flared briefly, then died. "It's been 5 years, Quincy. The trail is cold. It would be my word against theirs, and I'm a fugitive." "Maybe." He took a sip of his coffee. "But things have a way of coming to light, given time and the right circumstances." The certainty in his voice was almost convincing, but Grace had lived with disappointment too long to embrace hope easily. "And in the meantime, you stay here, rest, gather your strength." His mouth quirked in a half-smile. "Ranch can always use another pair of hands." The offer was tempting more than tempting. A respite from running, a chance to stay in one place without constantly looking over her shoulder. And there was Quincy himself, this man who believed in her when no one else had for so long. "What about your boss?" she asked. "What will you tell him, the truth, when he returns?" Quincy met her gaze steadily. "Colonel Harrington is a fair man. He understands something about injustice." Grace hesitated, torn between caution and desperate need for the sanctuary he offered. "I don't want to bring trouble to your door. Trouble has a way of finding me with or without your help," he replied with a wry smile. "At least this time it's for something worthwhile." The simple statement, delivered with such quiet conviction, broke something loose inside her, a dam of emotion she had held back for years. To her horror, tears began to spill down her cheeks. "I'm sorry," she whispered, trying to wipe them away. "I don't usually." Quincy reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. "Don't apologize for being human, Grace." They sat like that for a long moment, her hand in his, the fire crackling in the hearth, a fragile connection forming between two people who had both seen more than their share of hardship. "All right," Grace said finally. "I'll stay for a while." The smile that spread across Quincy's face was like sunrise after a long night, warm and full of promise. "Good," he said simply. "That's good." The following days established a new rhythm as Grace settled into life at the Circle G. Quincy introduced her to the handful of ranch hands as Mrs. Nichols, a widow hired to put the house in order before the boss returned. If any of them thought it unusual, they kept their opinions to themselves. Grace threw herself into work, grateful for the distraction. The main house, while not neglected, certainly benefited from a woman's touch. She cleaned, organized, and even began cooking meals for Quincy and occasionally for the foreman, a gruff older man named Jenkins who treated her with gruff respect. December deepened, bringing colder weather and occasional snow flurries. The work of the ranch continued regardless, cattle to be tended, repairs to be made, supplies to be hauled from town. Quincy was often gone from dawn until dusk, returning tired but seemingly content with the day's labor. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes in comfortable silence. Grace found herself looking forward to these quiet hours when the rest of the world seemed to recede. and there was just the two of them, the crackling flames and a growing understanding that neither put into words. She learned more about him during these evenings, how he had left Tennessee at 17 to fight for the Union despite his family's Southern sympathies, how he had found purpose in the ordered chaos of Army life, and how the war's end had left him adrift until Colonel Harrington had suggested he try his hand at cattle driving. "Never meant to stay with it this long," he admitted one night as they sat side by side on the hearth rug, mugs of coffee in hand. "Thought I'd save up, buy some land of my own eventually." "What kind of land?" Grace asked, genuinely curious about the dreams of this man who had so unexpectedly become her protector. "Something like this," he replied, gesturing vaguely toward the window where darkness had fallen over the ranch. "Not as big, maybe, but good grazing land, a decent house." He glanced at her, then away quickly. "Place where a man could put down roots." The wistfulness in his voice resonated with something deep inside her, a longing for stability, for home, for connection that she had suppressed for so long it was almost painful to acknowledge. "That sounds nice," she said softly, staring into the flames to avoid the intensity of emotions his words had stirred. "Yeah." Quincy shifted slightly, his shoulder brushing against hers in a way that sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. "It does." The days passed, bringing Christmas ever closer. Grace noticed Quincy making mysterious trips to town, returning with parcels he wouldn't let her see. When she questioned him, he just smiled and said, "You'll find out soon enough." On Christmas Eve, she spent the day preparing a special dinner: roast chicken, potatoes, fresh bread, and an apple pie made from preserved fruit. The kitchen was warm and fragrant as Quincy returned from his duties, stamping snow from his boots in the entryway. "Smells like heaven in here," he declared, hanging his coat and hat by the door. Grace smiled, pleased by his appreciation. "Dinner's almost ready, go wash up." It was a domestic scene that would have seemed impossible just weeks before, the two of them moving comfortably around each other in the shared space. The table set with the house's best dishes, evergreen boughs arranged with red ribbon as a centerpiece. When they finally sat down to eat, Grace was struck by how right it felt, this moment of peace and companionship on a holy night. They ate with good appetite, talking easily about the day's events, the ranch's prospects for the coming year, the latest news from town. After dinner, they moved to the hearth where Quincy had built up the fire to a cheerful blaze. To Grace's surprise, he produced a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Merry Christmas," he said, holding it out to her with an almost shy expression. Grace stared at the package in shock. "I didn't get you anything," she protested. "I didn't think, don't need anything," he interrupted gently. "Go on, open it." With trembling fingers, Grace untied the string and unwrapped the paper to reveal a small leather-bound book. Opening it, she found blank pages of good quality paper, the kind used for journals or diaries. "Thought you might like a fresh start," Quincy explained, watching her reaction carefully. "For new memories." The simple gift, so perfectly attuned to her needs and circumstances, brought tears to her eyes. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Thank you." Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, the careful distance they had maintained despite their growing closeness suddenly narrowing, charged with unspoken feelings. "Grace," Quincy said softly, her name on his lips sounding like a prayer. And then he was leaning toward her, or perhaps she toward him, and his hand was gently cradling her cheek, and their lips met in a kiss as natural and inevitable as sunrise. It was a gentle kiss at first, tentative, questioning. But when Grace responded, sliding her arms around his neck, it deepened into something more urgent, years of loneliness and longing finding expression in this most basic human connection. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Quincy rested his forehead against hers. "Been wanting to do that since the trapper's cabin," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. Grace smiled, a genuine smile that felt strange and wonderful on her face. "Why didn't you?" "Didn't think the time was right. You had enough to deal with." His thumb traced the curve of her cheek. "Still do, I suppose." "Yes," she agreed, leaning into his touch. "But this helps," he laughed softly, the sound warming her more effectively than the fire. "Glad to be of service, madam." They spent the remainder of Christmas Eve by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes kissing, sometimes simply holding each other as the flames danced and the wind sang around the eaves of the house. It was a gift greater than any Grace could have imagined, this moment of peace, of connection, of being truly seen and accepted. As Christmas Day dawned clear and cold, Grace woke in her small room off the kitchen with a sense of possibility she hadn't felt in years. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and she had no illusions that her troubles were over, she was no longer facing them alone. The holiday passed in quiet celebration. Several of the ranch hands who had nowhere else to go joined them for Christmas dinner, bringing an unexpected warmth to the occasion. Watching Quincy interact with these men, respectful but friendly, authoritative but never condescending, Grace felt a deepening appreciation for the man he was. As December gave way to January, their relationship evolved naturally, as if they had both been waiting for each other without knowing it. They were careful to maintain propriety around the ranch hands. She was still officially the housekeeper, after all, but in private moments, they allowed themselves to explore this newfound connection. Colonel Harrington was due to return in mid-January, a fact that loomed large in Grace's thoughts. Would he accept her presence? Would he believe her story? Despite Quincy's assurances, she couldn't help but worry. "He's a fair man," Quincy reminded her one evening as they discussed the impending arrival, "and he respects my judgment." But harboring a fugitive is different from hiring a new ranch hand, Grace pointed out. He could lose everything if the authorities found out. Quincy took her hand, his expression serious. "The colonel fought a war over what he believed was right, Grace. He won't turn away from what's right now." His confidence was reassuring, but Grace couldn't entirely shake her apprehension. Too many times, she had trusted in others' goodwill only to be disappointed. The day of Colonel Harrington's return dawned clear and cold. Grace had risen early to ensure the house was immaculate, a fresh baked loaf of bread cooling on the kitchen table. Quincy had ridden out to meet his employer at the stage depot in Denver, leaving her alone with her nervous anticipation. When she heard the sound of horses approaching in the early afternoon, Grace smoothed her dress, her best one, purchased in Denver before her hasty departure, and took a deep breath to steady herself. The men who entered were still stamping snow from their boots and unwrapping mufflers from their faces when Grace stepped from the kitchen to greet them. Quincy immediately moved to her side, a silent show of support that steadied her. "Colonel, this is Grace Norton," he said simply. "The lady I mentioned in my letter." Colonel James Harrington was a tall, distinguished man in his 50s with iron gray hair and the straight posture of a career military man. His piercing eyes took in Grace's appearance with a thoroughness that suggested he missed very little. "Miss Norton," he said, inclining his head slightly. "Or is it Mrs.?" "Miss," Grace replied, meeting his gaze directly, "though I've been using Mrs. Nichols for convenience." A hint of a smile touched the colonel's weathered face. "Understood." He glanced around the main room, taking in the changes Grace had made during his absence. "The place looks good, better than when I left it." "Thank you, sir." Harrington hung his coat on the peg by the door, then turned back to face them both. "Quincy's letter mentioned some trouble." "Something about being wrongfully accused," Grace glanced at Quincy, who nodded encouragingly. "Yes, sir, 5 years ago in St. Louis." "Well, let's hear it then." The colonel settled into his chair by the fire, gesturing for them to sit as well. "The full story, if you please." So Grace told him everything from her father's investment with Whitaker to the discovery of the embezzlement, the murder, her framing, and the 5 years of running that had followed. As she spoke, Harrington's expression remained impassive, though his eyes narrowed at certain points in her narrative. When she had finished, the colonel was silent for a long moment. "You have proof of these allegations?" he finally asked. Grace produced her diary from the pocket of her dress. "Everything is documented here, dates, amounts, meetings, and there's a letter from Whitaker to my father admitting to temporary appropriation of funds. It wasn't enough for the authorities then, but..." Harrington took the diary, thumbing through its pages with careful attention. "Mind if I keep this for a few days? Want to study it properly?" The request sent a spike of anxiety through Grace. The diary was her only tangible evidence, but she nodded. "Of course." The colonel looked at Quincy, then back at Grace. "Quincy vouches for you." "That carries considerable weight with me." He closed the diary carefully. "For now, you're welcome to stay at the Circle G. We'll figure out the rest as we go." Relief washed over Grace in a dizzying wave. "Thank you, sir." Harrington waved away her gratitude. "No need for that." Never could abide injustice, especially when it's wrapped up in money and influence. He rose from his chair. "Now, something smells mighty fine coming from that kitchen." The tacit acceptance from Colonel Harrington marked a turning point. With his blessing, Grace's position at the ranch shifted from temporary refuge to something more permanent. She continued to manage the household, but now openly acknowledged as someone under the colonel's protection. January gave way to February, and still, there was no sign that Radcliffe had connected her to the Circle G. Life settled into a pleasant routine: work during the day, evenings with Quincy, and increasingly frequent strategy sessions with the colonel, who had taken a keen interest in her case. "Man like Radcliffe has enemies," Harrington observed one evening as the three of them sat around the table reviewing her diary for perhaps the 10th time. "And friends who might turn on him for the right incentive." "Money, you mean?" Grace asked, "sometimes, or fear of exposure themselves." The colonel tapped the diary thoughtfully. "From what you've documented here, Whitaker wasn't the only one involved in this scheme. Radcliffe and at least 2 others were equally complicit." Quincy leaned forward. "If we could find one of them willing to talk." "Exactly." Harrington nodded approvingly. "Divide and conquer, military strategy, but it works just as well in civilian matters." The idea of actively seeking justice rather than merely evading capture was both terrifying and exhilarating to Grace. For so long, her sole focus had been survival. The possibility of clearing her name seemed almost too much to hope for. "How would we even begin?" she asked. "I have some contacts in St. Louis," the colonel replied. "People who owe me favors. I'll write to them, see what the current situation is with Radcliffe and his associates." Quincy reached for Grace's hand under the table, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "We'll be careful," he promised. "No moves until we have more information." The colonel nodded, a faint smile playing around his mouth as he observed their joined hands. Indeed, patience is key in any campaign. He gathered the papers spread across the table. "I'll draft those letters tonight. In the meantime, life continues as normal." Normal had taken on a new meaning for Grace. It now included not just work and routine, but also the developing relationship with Quincy, deep conversations by the fire, stolen kisses in the kitchen, the gradual building of trust and intimacy between 2 people who had both known their share of loneliness. As February progressed, they began cautiously planning for a future together. Quincy spoke more concretely about his dream of owning land, and for the first time in years, Grace allowed herself to imagine a settled life, a home, perhaps children someday, a place where she belonged. "Got my eye on a parcel about 10 miles south of here," Quincy told her one evening as they walked along the fence line, enjoying a rare mild day. "Good water, decent grazing, small cabin that could be fixed up." Grace smiled at the enthusiasm in his voice. "It sounds perfect." "Would be," he agreed, then hesitated. "Especially if you were there." She stopped walking, turning to face him. "Quincy Grayson, are you asking me something?" He looked suddenly boyish, almost shy. "Not officially, not yet." He took both her hands in his. "Seems right to clear your name first, before I ask you to share mine." The sentiment was so perfectly in keeping with his character, honorable, thoughtful, putting her needs before his own desires, that Grace felt her heart might burst with affection for him. "I don't need to wait for that," she said softly. "I already know my answer." The kiss that followed was a promise of commitment, of a shared future, of love that had grown steadily from that first night by a small campfire when he had simply offered, "Rest with me." March arrived with its unpredictable weather: snow one day, sunshine the next, and with it came news from the colonel's contacts in St. Louis. The three of them gathered in Harrington's study to review the letters that had arrived by stage. "It seems," the colonel began, adjusting his reading glasses, "that Radcliffe's empire isn't as solid as it once was. The financial panic of '73 hit him hard, and he's been scrambling to rebuild ever since." "Is that why he's in Denver?" Quincy asked, "looking for new opportunities?" "Apparently so, railroad investments primarily." Harrington shuffled through the papers. "More interestingly, one of his former partners, a man named Edward Hollister, has had a falling out with Radcliffe, rather public, according to my source." Grace stiffened at the name. "Hollister was there that night, one of the men who found me with Whitaker's body. And now he and Radcliffe are at odds." The colonel looked thoughtful. "That could be useful." Over the next week, a plan began to take shape. Harrington, using his military connections, arranged for a trusted former comrade now working as a Pinkerton detective to approach Hollister in St. Louis. The detective would present certain evidence from Grace's diary, enough to make Hollister nervous, but not enough to show their full hand. "The goal is to turn him against Radcliffe," the colonel explained. "Offer him immunity if he testifies about what really happened that night." It was a dangerous gambit, but one that offered the first real hope of clearing Grace's name in 5 years. As March gave way to April, they received word that the detective had made contact with Hollister and found him receptive, if cautious. "He's scared," Harrington reported after receiving a telegram. "Claims Radcliffe was the one who actually killed Whitaker when he threatened to expose their scheme. Says he went along with framing you because he feared for his own life." Grace felt a surge of vindication mixed with bitter anger. "So I've spent 5 years running because these men were too cowardly to face the consequences of their actions." Quincy placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "What matters is that Hollister's willing to talk now. That's our opening." The plan progressed carefully over the following weeks. Hollister agreed to sign a sworn affidavit detailing the events of that night in exchange for immunity from prosecution. The Pinkerton detective secured the document and sent a copy to Colonel Harrington, who immediately took it to Judge Wilcox, a respected jurist in Denver known for his incorruptibility. "Judge wants to meet you," Harrington informed Grace after returning from town. "Privately, at his home. Says if your account matches Hollister's statement, he'll issue an order for Radcliffe's arrest and send a recommendation to the governor of Missouri for a full pardon in your case." Hope, so long suppressed, bloomed painfully in Grace's chest. "When? Tomorrow evening. Quincy and I will accompany you." The meeting with Judge Wilcox was both terrifying and surreal. After 5 years of avoiding authority figures of any kind, Grace found herself seated in the elegant study of one of Denver's most prominent citizens, recounting her story yet again while the judge listened with keen attention. When she had finished, Wilcox compared her account with Hollister's statement, noting the points of agreement. "Remarkable consistency," he commented, "especially considering you haven't spoken with Hollister in 5 years." "Because it's the truth, Your Honor," Grace replied simply. The judge studied her for a long moment. "I believe it is, Miss Norton." He set the papers aside. "I'll issue the warrant for Radcliffe's arrest first thing in the morning. As for your situation, I'll write to Governor Hardin of Missouri today recommending a full pardon based on this new evidence." Grace could hardly believe what she was hearing. "And until then, you remain under Colonel Harrington's protection." Wilcox glanced at Quincy, something knowing in his expression. "I understand that arrangement has proven satisfactory." The following day, Samuel Radcliffe was arrested at his hotel in Denver, charged with the murder of Benjamin Whitaker and multiple counts of fraud. The story caused a sensation in the city's newspapers, particularly when it became known that the woman he had framed had been living in Denver for months. Grace remained secluded at the ranch during the initial uproar, but as April turned to May and news arrived that the governor of Missouri had indeed issued a full pardon based on Hollister's testimony and Judge Wilcox's recommendation, she gradually began to emerge from hiding. Her first public appearance was at church in Denver, accompanied by Quincy and Colonel Harrington. There were curious glances and whispers, of course, but the colonel's respected position in the community and Judge Wilcox's public statement supporting her innocence provided a shield against the worst of the gossip. "How does it feel?" Quincy asked as they rode back to the ranch that Sunday. "Being able to show your face without fear," Grace considered the question seriously. "Strange," she admitted. "Like putting on clothes that used to fit but don't quite anymore." She glanced at him. "I've been running for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to stay still." He reached across to take her hand, their horses walking side by side. "You'll learn, we both will." The promise in those simple words, "we both will," filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the May sunshine. After so many years of solitude, the idea of facing the future together was the greatest gift she could imagine. As spring deepened into early summer, Grace and Quincy finalized their plans. The parcel of land he had mentioned was purchased with his savings, and work began on improving the small cabin. Colonel Harrington, who had become something of a father figure to both of them, insisted on providing a herd of 50 cattle as a wedding gift. "Need to start a proper ranch," he declared when they protested the generosity. "Consider it an investment in two people who deserve some good fortune." Their wedding took place on a perfect June day, with the mountains rising blue and majestic in the background and wildflowers carpeting the meadows around the Circle G. It was a small ceremony, just the ranch hands, a few friends from town, Judge Wilcox, who performed the ceremony, and Colonel Harrington, who proudly gave the bride away. Grace wore a simple dress of ivory silk, her hair arranged with sprigs of wild roses. Quincy, looking somewhat uncomfortable but undeniably handsome in a new suit, waited for her beneath an arch of woven branches, his expression transforming to one of wonder as she walked toward him. The vows they exchanged were traditional, but spoken with a depth of feeling that moved even the most stoic of the ranch hands to suspicious throat-clearing and eye-rubbing. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, and Quincy bent to kiss his bride, a spontaneous cheer erupted from the small gathering. The celebration continued well into the evening, with food and drink, music from a fiddle player brought in from town, and dancing under lantern light as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. As the night deepened and guests began to depart, Quincy led Grace away from the festivities toward the small rise behind the main house where they had often walked during their courtship. From this vantage point, they could see the lights of the ranch below and, in the far distance, the glow of Denver against the night sky. "Happy, Mrs. Grayson?" Quincy asked, his arm around her waist. The name, her new name, freely chosen rather than adopted in fear, brought a smile to Grace's lips. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she answered truthfully. He turned to face her, his expression serious despite the joy of the day. "I promise you this, Grace, you'll never have to run again, not while I'm breathing." She reached up to touch his face, this man who had sat beside her fire that night and changed the course of her life with 4 simple words. "I know," she said softly. "That's why I love you." As they stood together under the vast canopy of stars, Grace Norton Grayson felt the last shadows of her 5 years on the run finally lifting. The past would always be part of her story, but it no longer defined her. What defined her now was this moment, this man, and the future they would build together, a future where rest was not just a temporary respite but a way of life, and where love was not a luxury but the foundation upon which everything else would be built. The small cabin on their new land gradually transformed into a proper home as summer progressed into fall. Quincy proved as skilled at carpentry as he was with cattle, adding a bedroom, enlarging the main living area, and constructing a wide porch where Grace could sit in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Their first year passed in a blur of hard work and quiet happiness. The small herd grew, the land yielded to their careful stewardship, and their home became a place of warmth and welcome. Colonel Harrington was a frequent visitor, as were some of the hands from the Circle G who had become friends during Grace's time there. In the spring of their second year, Grace discovered she was expecting a child. The news brought both joy and a touch of fear. The world could still be a dangerous place, and bringing a new life into it was both a blessing and a responsibility. What if I'm not good at this? She confessed to Quincy one night as they lay in bed, his hand gently resting on the slight swell of her stomach. Being a mother, I haven't exactly had a normal life to prepare me. Quincy propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her with tenderness. You've survived things that would have broken most people, Grace. You're strong, patient, and more loving than you give yourself credit for. His smile was gentle in the lamplight. Our child is lucky to have you as a mother. The simple confidence in his words eased her fears, as his steadfast belief in her always had. Together, they prepared for the new arrival Quincy, adding a nursery to the house while Grace sewed tiny garments and read everything she could find about child care. Their son, James Quincy Grayson, was born on a crisp October morning with Colonel Harrington pacing nervously on the porch while the doctor and a neighbor woman attended to the delivery. When Quincy finally emerged with the tiny bundle in his arms to present to his honorary grandfather, the old soldier's eyes filled with uncharacteristic tears. "Fine boy," he declared gruffly. "Got his father's chin and his mother's spirit, I'd wager." Life settled into a new pattern with young James, known as Jamie, at its center. The days were fuller, the nights sometimes shorter, but the joy he brought more than compensated for the challenges of parenthood. Grace discovered that her years of vigilance had given her a patience and resourcefulness that served her well as a mother. As Jamie grew from infant to toddler, the ranch prospered. Quincy's careful management and hard work resulted in a steadily growing herd and improved pastures. They added a barn, expanded their garden, and even planted an orchard that would someday provide fruit for their table. Grace found herself keeping a journal again, not to document injustice this time, but to record the simple joys and small miracles of their daily life. She wrote about Jamie's first steps, about the way Quincy still looked at her as if she were the most precious thing he'd ever seen, about the changing seasons on their land and the growing sense of permanence that had once seemed impossible. In the spring of Jamie's third year, Grace discovered she was expecting again. This time, the news brought pure joy, unmarred by the fears that had accompanied her first pregnancy. Their daughter, Elizabeth Grace, arrived in the winter, a tiny miracle with her mother's delicate features and, as Quincy noted with amused resignation, a cry that could probably be heard in Denver. The love that had begun that night by a campfire in the wilderness had deepened and matured, weathering the challenges of ranch life, parenthood, and the occasional shadows from the past. There were still moments when Grace would startle at an unexpected knock on the door or instinctively scan the horizon for signs of pursuit. But those moments grew rarer as the years passed, and new memories overlaid the old fears. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Quincy surprised Grace with a trip to Denver, their first real excursion away from the ranch since Elizabeth's birth. Colonel Harrington, now showing his age but still spry in spirit, insisted on staying at the ranch with his honorary grandchildren to allow the couple some time alone. Denver had grown even more in the intervening years: new buildings, more people, the unmistakable energy of a city coming into its own. Yet as they checked into the Brown Palace Hotel, now the finest accommodation in the city, Grace felt none of the fear that had once dominated her existence there. "Strange to think that I was hiding in Mrs. Calloway's boarding house just a few miles from here," she remarked as they settled into their elegant room. So afraid of being discovered, Quincy drew her into his arms, still as strong and steady as the day they had met. "And now look at you, Mrs. Quincy Grayson, respectable rancher's wife, mother of two, shopping in Denver's finest stores without a care in the world." She smiled up at him, touching the lines that hard work and Colorado sun had etched around his eyes. "Not exactly without a care. I'm fairly certain our son is talking the colonel into letting him ride that new colt, despite our explicit instructions." Quincy laughed, the sound as warming to her as it had been the first time she'd heard it. Poor Colonel doesn't stand a chance against Jamie when he sets his mind to something. Wonder where he gets that from? Grace affected an innocent expression. Certainly not from me. Certainly not, he agreed with mock seriousness, pulling her closer. You've never been stubborn a day in your life. Their laughter mingled as he bent to kiss her, the connection between them as vital and necessary as breath itself. 5 years of marriage had not dimmed the spark between them, if anything. It had deepened, enriched by shared joys and challenges, by the family they had created together. That evening, as they dined in the hotel's opulent restaurant, Quincy raised his glass in a toast. To the night, a weary cowboy stumbled upon a campfire in the wilderness and found the other half of his soul. Grace touched her glass to his, emotion tightening her throat. And to the woman who was running for so long, until someone finally told her to rest. As they returned to their ranch the following day, the familiar landscape spreading before them, the mountains rising majestically in the distance, the rolling grasslands where their cattle grazed, the sturdy house they had built together, Grace felt a profound sense of completion. The journey that had begun in fear and desperation had led, against all odds, to this. A life rich with love, purpose, and belonging. The nightmare of those 5 years on the run had not defined her. After all, it had merely been the dark path that led, eventually, to light. And as Quincy reached for her hand, his touch as reassuring as it had been that first night by the fire, Grace knew with absolute certainty that she had found what everyone seeks but few truly find. Not just a place to rest, but a place to belong, with a love that would endure through whatever challenges the future might bring.